Welcome, everyone, to another deep dive, and today we're taking a look at the life and the tragic passing of Philip Seymour Hoffman. The sources that we have for this episode paint a really poignant picture of his later years, and especially the events kind of leading up to that day in 2014. So we're going to explore not just the headlines, but, the man behind them, right?
Right.
So we're looking at, the incredible talent, the devastating addiction, and the pressures that come with, a life lived in the spotlight.
Yeah, it's a story that really raises a lot of questions. How could someone who had so much success and so much to live for fall prey to such a powerful force? And that's really what we're going to try to unpack today, looking closely at the events that unfolded and, just the complexities of addiction in and of itself.
Yeah, and it starts so subtly back in 2012. Hoffman actually confides in Mimi O'Donnell, his partner at the time, that he's thinking about having a drink. And this is after over 2 decades of sobriety. So can you kind of shed some light on why someone might consider doing that after being sober for so long and knowing the risks?
Yeah, it seems unfathomable.
Yeah.
But addiction is a chronic relapsing disease. So even after years of sobriety, the brain's pathways, especially those associated with craving and reward, can be reactivated. And that can be by triggers, things like stress or certain environments, even just like social situations can make those pathways reactivate. It's a constant battle. And for Hoffman, that one drink really seems to have been a tipping point.
Yeah, and then things start to really escalate. It's like a snowball effect. The sources describe it moving quickly from prescription drugs and then to heroin. It's like this undertow pulling him further and further away. And O'Donnell's trying to protect their children, so she makes this really difficult decision to separate their home life from his addiction.
Yeah, it's just a classic example of the ripple effect of addiction, how it just impacts everyone involved, not just the individual. And O'Donnell's choice is absolutely heartbreaking, but you can definitely understand why she did it. She was just trying to create a stable environment for her children while still hoping that Hoffman would recover.
And that's where we encounter this really important location, 35 Bethune Street. It was a small apartment in the West Village that Hoffman moved into, and it was just a few blocks from his family. He was hoping for a fresh start there, kind of a sanctuary.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting juxtaposition, isn't it? You have this quiet, historic neighborhood known for its charm and beauty. And in the middle of it, this apartment becomes the backdrop for all of these internal struggles that Hoffman is going through. It was intended as a safe haven, a place to get better. But isolation like that, for someone battling addiction, that can be really dangerous.
Right. And in late 2013, there's a brief period where he is sober, but the sources describe him as being incredibly vulnerable, almost like he was stripped bare after that. Is that a common thing for people in recovery?
No, absolutely. Recovery is not a linear path. It's full of ups and downs.
Yeah.
And that period after you detox and do the initial treatment, that can be so fragile. The body's readjusting, the mind is vulnerable, and there's just this enormous temptation to relapse.
Right. So then January of 2014 rolls around and Hoffman returns from filming Mockingjay Part 2. And there are photos of him at a bar, clearly intoxicated, right before a flight. And it's such a stark contrast from the, clean-cut image we've come to associate with him. It's really clear at this point that he's slipping away.
Yeah, and one of the biggest red flags is that he starts to withdraw from his friends. It's a classic sign that addiction is really taking over. And the isolation of that apartment, which was meant to be this safe haven, it really might have made things worse. It becomes this place where the addiction can thrive.
Right. Then comes February 2nd, and Hoffman doesn't show up to pick up his children. And Mimi O'Donnell starts to get this really bad feeling. She asks playwright David Barketz to go check on him.
Right, and Katz, along with Hoffman's assistant, Isabella Wingdavy, they go to the apartment and make that horrific discovery. They find him lifeless on the bathroom floor, needles still in his arm, and the place is just surrounded by bags of heroin. It really just shatters that illusion of fame and fortune and reminds us that addiction can affect anyone, no matter who they are.
And of course, the news spreads like wildfire.
Yeah.
The street outside of the Pickford house where his apartment was, it's swarming with NYPD, reporters, photographers, just heartbroken fans. It's this really harsh collision between his private struggles and his very public persona.
Yeah, and then the autopsy comes back. And it's just this tragic cocktail of drugs, heroin, cocaine, benzodiazepines, which are basically tranquilizers, and amphetamines as well. So it was polydrug use, which is extremely dangerous. You combine depressants and stimulants, and it's just unpredictable and often fatal. It's just another sign of how bad his struggle really was.
Yeah. And the entertainment world is just reeling. It forces everyone to have this conversation about the pressures of fame and just how insidious addiction really is. It's such a tragedy, and it really highlights the human cost behind all of the glitz and glamour of Hollywood.
It's interesting how a place, a building, can become so intertwined with a tragedy like this. The Pixford House, this beautiful 19th century structure in the West Village, now it will always be connected with Hoffman's passing.
Right, and it makes you think about everyone who was left behind. His children, Mimi O'Donnell, his friends, colleagues. They lost not just this celebrated actor, but a father, a partner, a friend. It really humanizes it all, takes away that celebrity facade, and reminds us about the real impact of addiction.
Yeah, his death really sparked a difficult conversation about the entertainment industry as a whole. And, its relationship with addiction. Are there enough support systems in place? Are we doing enough to address the stigma so people feel like they can actually reach out for help?
It's easy to get caught up in the celebrity of it all, to look at a famous person and think, oh, they have everything, they're fine. But they're human too, just as vulnerable as anyone else, maybe even more so, given the insane amount of pressure they face.
Yeah, the demands of Hollywood are unreal. The constant scrutiny, the pressure to perform, the work, the promotion, it's relentless. And for someone who's already struggling with addiction, those things can be a recipe for disaster.
So what can be done? I mean, what kind of support systems are there within the industry, and are they actually effective?
Well, there are organizations like the Motion Picture and Television Fund, and they provide a whole range of services, including addiction treatment, but access, awareness, and the fear of what it'll do to your career, those are still huge barriers. There needs to be a much more open dialogue, more resources, and just a culture overall that puts mental health and well-being ahead of image and performance.
Right, because it always seems like we only hear about these tragedies after the fact when it's already too late. What would it look like to actually support people before they reach that breaking point?
That's the million-dollar question. I think it requires a total shift in perspective. We need to move away from just focusing on individual responsibility and acknowledge the systemic factors that are at play. We need to create an environment where someone can be vulnerable without being seen as weak, where it's an opportunity to step in and offer support.
It's about changing the whole narrative, isn't it? Moving away from all the judgment and blame and creating a space for empathy and understanding.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that addiction doesn't discriminate. It affects people from every background, every profession. It's a human issue, and it needs a human response.
And in the middle of all of this, we have Philip Seymour Hoffman's incredible legacy as an artist. I mean, his performances, they were just captivating, so raw, so real. He had this ability to disappear into a role, to make you feel every single emotion.
Yeah, he was a master of his craft. Capote, Doubt, The Master. He brought this incredible depth and complexity to his roles that few actors can match. And in a way, you wonder if maybe his own struggles contributed to that, to his ability to portray the human condition with all of its flaws.
It's almost this tragic paradox. The very industry that gave him a platform that allowed his talent to shine might have also contributed to his downfall.
It's complicated for sure. And Hoffman's story is a stark reminder that success and fame don't make you immune to addiction. It's a fight. And sometimes the most talented people are fighting the hardest battles.
And his work, his performances, they still resonate so deeply with audiences. But it's hard to separate the art from the tragedy now.
Yeah, it adds this layer of sadness to it, doesn't it? Knowing what he was going through, the demons he was fighting, it makes you think about the toll it took on him, the price of his incredible talent.
And it leaves us with that really difficult question. What if? What other incredible performances could he have given us if he had overcome his addiction?
That question will always linger. But maybe instead of focusing on what we lost, we can look at what we can learn from his story, how we can use this as a way to actually create change.
To honor his memory by not just appreciating his work, but by creating a future where fewer artists, fewer people have to suffer like he did. I think Hoffman's death, it really showed us that anyone can be affected by addiction. You know, we tend to see these huge celebrities and forget that they struggle just like we do.
Yeah, definitely a wake-up call. Addiction doesn't care who you are or how much money you have or how talented you are. It affects us all, and it's something we need to be talking about more openly and honestly.
So I guess that brings up the question of whether or not we as a society have a responsibility to protect vulnerable people, especially those who are in the public eye. Or is it just up to each individual to deal with their struggles?
That's a tough one. There's a balance between offering support and respecting someone's privacy. But maybe we can start by changing the way we think about asking for help. It should be seen as a sign of strength, not weakness.
It's so easy to judge, right? To just say, well, they should just get help. But addiction is complicated.
Absolutely.
There's the stigma, the shame, the fear of what people will think. All of those things can prevent someone from reaching out.
And those barriers are even higher for people in the public eye. They're constantly being scrutinized by the media, and their careers are on the line. It can feel impossible to ask for help.
So how do we change that? How do we create an environment where people feel safe seeking help no matter what?
Well, I think education is key. We need to start treating addiction like the disease that it is. We need to challenge the stereotypes and create a culture that's built on empathy and support.
Right. It's about recognizing that anyone can be affected by this. It's not a sign of weakness to ask for help.
Exactly. And we need to make sure that those resources are readily available. Treatment facilities, support groups, mental health services, all of those things are absolutely essential.
It's like what we were talking about earlier. We're all human. We all have our own struggles, our own battles that we're fighting. And sometimes the people who seem to have it all together are the ones who are hurting the most.
Philip Seymour Hoffman's story is a perfect example of that. He was brilliant. He was a great father. He was a complex person who struggled with addiction for a long time. His legacy is complicated, marked by both his immense talent and the tragedy of his death.
And it forces us to ask these really tough questions about fame, addiction, and what we owe to each other.
There aren't any easy answers, but I think the biggest takeaway here is that we need to be kinder. We need to be more understanding and more willing to offer support without judgment. We need to create a world where people feel safe enough to ask for help when they need it.
So on that note, here's a final thought. Go watch one of Philip Seymour Hoffman's films. Really watch it. Appreciate his talent, his dedication to his craft, but also remember the person behind the performance. Remember that even the brightest stars can have their own darkness. And maybe if we can all acknowledge that, we can start to create a world where fewer lights go out too soon.